Good afternoon, my name's Tim, I'm an alcoholic. I'm also a member of Al-Anon. I was going to say a few words in the local language, but unfortunately I don't speak Australian. It's downhill from here. Thank you to the wonderful committee for organising this. I've had an absolute blast. Thank you to the other two programme speakers, because everything that needs to be said has been said. So I'm sort of off the hook now. And thank you to all of the other people who've spoken. I like the design of this convention, which allows people to speak from the floor and where we get to hear from all sorts of voices. Different types of voices, different fellowships. It's very helpful. When the rainstorm was storming this morning, I was thinking about, as we're on this enchanted island, a particular play which starts with a storm, where this cast of characters, because of the storm, gets washed up on this magical island. And I think that's true, firstly, of this convention, and more generally, of certainly my story in AA over the last 30 years. I'm not in AA by my design. I'm not still sober through my skill or wit or anything. But I think my sobriety is something of a cautionary tale. Over the years, I've seen people drop away or be picked off to the left, to the right, levitating out at the top of AA, or falling out at the bottom. My job in AA is not to be in charge of my sobriety, but to pay attention to a few small things to make sure that when I die sober. And what I would have said years ago, you hear a lot of scare stories in AA about the horror of dying an alcoholic death. And those are not untrue. But over the last year, a number of people I've known have died, some sober, some not sober, some not in AA. And someone I know who died under the influence of substances simply fell unconscious and drowned in his swimming pool. And we were told this is the most peaceful possible death he could have had. And I've seen people die sober in enormous pain. I'm not in AA because I want to avoid pain. My brother was an alcoholic who committed suicide in his late 20s. I discovered many years later he'd been sober in AA, but had slipped and couldn't see the point. And I very nearly died on my last slip, which was on the 24th of July 1993. A lot of people had fun when they were drinking. I had a lot of things when I was drinking, and fun was rarely one of them. Excitement was in there. But on that last day, I'd been to an AA meeting. I left the meeting halfway through, got drunk, and was filled with mischief. And so I intentionally caused a traffic incident. And a car screeched to a halt a few inches from my head. And It was soon after that I realised I wanted to stay sober in AA, that it was worth giving a go. But it was, as I say, not for happiness, which seemed quite out of the question, and not for comfort, but for a word I don't think I'd ever used in my life before, which was dignity. I wanted the dignity of being sober. I wanted no longer to have the indignity of being arrested for being drunk and disorderly at 1 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, covered in sick. What AA has guaranteed me is sobriety, and what that entails is dignity, that I get to live a worthwhile life and a dignified life. And the emotions are going to come and go. And I have to say, over the last year, when my best friend died of active alcoholism last summer, when another very close friend died of cancer in November, and when my mother died a couple of months ago, there were considerable feelings. If I were to drink again, and it's not out of the question that anyone might drink again, paying attention for long enough in AA has made that very clear, that there is no guarantee. I don't think would be because of emotion. It's very interesting in the Big Book, that the Big Book, if you... I know we've all read it a number of times, but there's reading it and there's really reading it. And I was a number of years sober before I really read it and realised how different a lot of its contents were from what I heard in meetings. One of the overwhelming themes in meetings, in my experience, is how we get this wonderful big life, very good. You get a job and you get a mortgage and you get a family and you have these wonderful reconciliations with all of your family members. And if you get too unhappy and too restless, irritable and discontent, you'll drink again. So you've got to keep your emotions in check. And it's a very curious thing. There are some characters in the Big Book, in the first few chapters, which are used by the authors, I believe, I'm just going from what I'm reading, to illustrate what alcoholism is about. And there's a chap who's called the Man of 30. And he has a wonderful period of 25 years of sobriety. And he thinks he can get away with it. He thinks that because he's competent, he's outgrown his youthful derelictions, he's able to drink normally. Who's in charge? He is. No one else in his little world, just him. And then there's the certain American businessman who goes to see Dr. Jung, a great psychoanalyst, I'm given to understand. And the book says he's in the peak of physical and mental condition, and yet he relapses, he drinks again. He didn't drink again because he was in a bad mood or because he had a resentment. There's something else going on here. And Jim, people, and if you're not familiar with these stories, go and look them up afterwards. Page 26, page 32, we're on to page 35 now, Jim's story. And people make a lot about Jim's story. So Jim describes his perfectly ordinary day, and there are ups and downs and decisions and lunch and a few words with the boss, and people make a great play of how he had a little resentment. But I won't ask you to shame yourselves by putting your hands up, but I bet more than one of you, and I include myself in this, has had a little resentment this week. Just a tiny little one, hardly worth mentioning. If having a little resentment got me drunk, well, I don't think... I'd either be talking to an empty room or there'd be no one up here. I get all sorts of funny little feelings. I have all sorts of funny little words with people. I hack people off, they hack me off. Part of life. I think, I may be wrong, I think the message of Jim's story, he had a perfectly ordinary day. Nothing out of the ordinary in his day. No intimations that he's going to drink. No, people read that story for all the special signs that King Alcohol is on its way, tracking him. And I don't think they're there. And if one wasn't certain about, there's Fred's story from page 39. And Fred is a splendid chap. And he's very successful, and we're supposed to be very impressed by this. And this mention of I don't know, handsome children of college age or something like that, and government bureaus, and there's lots of showing off in it. It's very charming. I'm not very charming. Anyway, he is very charming, and he has a simply splendid day. And they stress, not a cloud on the horizon. But he drinks. So there's something else going on. I don't think it's about emotion. When you read those stories, each of their narratives is about themselves. Them at the steering wheel, in charge of their lives. And the same phrases appear. There's a phrase, for a while all went well. And then in the other story, there's a phrase, for a while all was well. Just because everything is going well does not mean I'm going to stay sober. Which lets me off the hook, because it means if things are going badly, it doesn't mean I'm going to get drunk. And there's a funny little line, the thought crossed my mind. A thought crosses Jim's mind, and a thought crosses Fred's mind. And I think the language misleads us. We'll start sentences with the phrase, I think, like, I'm in charge and I'm doing a thing called thinking, like cooking an egg or making the bed or getting on a flight to Bali. I had no idea where Bali was. I had to look it up on a map. It said it was next to Lombok. I was no wiser for that. It's the only thing I know. It's a very, very long way away. That's the main thing I know. Where was I? I don't think. My thoughts think themselves at me. It's like I'm watching a screen, and this is happening, and there are a few little dials you can twist, but I don't make a thought happen. I create certain conditions, and then thoughts appear. I'm the observer of my thoughts. I'm not the thinker of my thoughts. Now, if I'm in charge of my life, what that really means is I'm doing what the thoughts on the screen tell me to do. I'm not really in charge. I'm obeying a set of thoughts which come from God knows where. Literally God knows where. So the thought crosses Jim's mind. Because it's his thought, he has a drink. Boom. Exactly the same with Fred. When I was around 17 years sober, someone I was immeasurably close to was drinking a little bit more vodka than was strictly good for him. And I was trying to get him to talk to my sponsor in AA, and this chap had been sober for a very long time. And we were waiting for the hour when he was going to be calling my sponsor from the other room, and my friend said, I think I'm going to order a pizza in. And the thought crossed my mind, it would just be easier if I joined him in this. and gave up the fight of wanting to get him sober and surrendered up this separation between me and him, I could cross over to the other side and we could be together in the drink. I didn't ask for that thought, but it was there. Maybe it's because you weren't in fit spiritual condition. What step weren't you working when you had that thought? If you did a proper step 11 at night, you wouldn't have thoughts like that. I had a perfectly good program, thank you. Not perfect, but what is. It's not about having a perfect program. The point is that I was in the habit of adopting an attitude of extreme skepticism towards the thoughts that cross my mind. Because I was trained militarily in AA over 17 years to adopt a position of skepticism towards my own thoughts. The fact that I had that thought had no power over me, and it just scooted on by and was replaced with another thought. A while later, I was in a situation where there would have been the opportunity to use substances, and that thought crossed my mind, and then another thought crossed my mind, which is, what would that do to my family? What would that do to my sponsees? I didn't care in that moment about my own welfare or my own happiness or my own future, but I'd learnt to care about other people. I have developed a sense of the worth of other people in AA way before I developed a sense of my own. I would see people come in when I was a few days sober. You see someone that's, 17 seconds sober, and you discover you care about whether or not they come back. You want them to stay. I didn't have to learn to love myself before I learned to love other people. I was placed in a position by Alcoholics Anonymous where involuntarily I found myself loving other people, and then about 15 to 20 years later I discovered I loved myself. That was the order in which things happened. Entirely involuntary. So why would a person drink again? In the play I referred to earlier, there's a magician who is in charge of an island. He's an exiled Duke of Milan, and he's in charge of an island, and he has magical powers. And there are two creatures on the island, amongst others, who are in his service. And one is called Ariel, who does everything right. And one is called Caliban, who is grudging. He will accept the service, but he's grudging and hateful. And Caliban gets a couple of accomplices called Stefano and Trinculo, who get drunk, interestingly. They're the two drunk characters. And they go to steal, the magician is called Prospero, they go to steal Prospero's robes. They're going to kill him, but first of all they go and try on his robes. The way I would drink again is trying on God's robes. Deciding that I'm in charge of my life. Deciding I'm in charge of your life. Deciding I know what's best for anyone else. Thinking I got myself here somehow. That mantle, that raiment of in-chargeness is what was the undoing of Jim and Fred. And the other characters in the big book. Now, I've still got to live my life, but I do it as second in command. In a sense, I think I'm still in the driving seat, except I'm following not my own directions, but a satellite navigation system. This is the island of meditation, it seems. There are whole towns which are devoted to it, and I need to tell you now, I'm not going to tell you anything useful about meditation. I know nothing about meditation in the Eastern sense or in the modern sense, but I know a tiny bit about meditation in the Big Book. And it's one of those words which, if you grabbed 100 people off the street today and said, what is meditation? You'd get images of cushions and bells and gongs and all sorts of wonderful things. What you would not get is someone sitting there in the morning with their cup of coffee, with a pen and a piece of paper, constructing their plan for the day. But that's exactly what it tells me to do. I came to AA with a very bad dose of alcoholism and a very bad dose of all sorts of other conditions of mind and body, shall we say, which I'm sure lots of labels could be slapped on, and labels were slapped on me from an early age. There was an awful lot wrong with me. I was antisocial. I was known to the police in more than one borough. I had panic attacks. I used to sit under furniture because I was too frightened to be exposed out in the open in a room this was a very frequent occurrence. I'd have to screw myself up into a ball and sort of fit myself on shelves. I was sometimes violent, mostly against physical objects, but nonetheless violence is violence. There was absolute rage inside me. And when I was about 5 years sober, I thought, right, I need to get on top of this meditation business. And what I didn't do was read the Big Book, or even the 12 and 12, which I think is not bad on the topic. I took the word out of the step, ran off, and said, into the world, and said, what does it mean? And I went to some classes and did some instruction. And I remember this terrible night. It was about 10:15, I was exhausted. And I thought, I know, I'm going to meditate. It's one of the steps. It's bound to help. So I got my little cushion, I sat on the cushion, and I tried to watch my thoughts. And within 7 seconds, I was suicidal. And I tried for 2 more minutes. And I couldn't. Well, maybe if you'd done a proper step 4, you wouldn't have been in that state. If your first and only step 4 was enough to clear all the crap out, well, good for you. I don't know if it's generational, but, my family was not the Waltons. There was a lot of stuff came down the tubes from my parents, from my grandparents, and manifested in me. It was not going to get overturned in a night. But the Big Book talks about prayer and meditation, pages 85 to 88, chiefly 86 to 88. And it says we're going to talk about prayer and meditation. Better people than us have been doing it. And we're going to give you some valuable suggestions. This means what they then say was what they thought meditation was for them. Now, there's nothing wrong with any other stuff, but I'm interested within AA in what the AA book says meditation is. And it talks, first of all, about some self-examination. And then, just one little thing about that. It says, were we resentful, selfish, dishonest, or afraid? Now, when I got sober, people used to call this nightly review a written step 10. And they used to do it with pen and paper. And they used to do a miniature step 4 every night for up to 40 minutes. And then they'd have to sort of call several people in the morning with it. And, who has the time? What it asks me actually to do is to say, were you frightened? Very good, well done. Were you resentful? Yes, good. What's your corrective measure? It doesn't ask me to analyse it. it asks me to set it aside. Exactly the same in step 10. We continue to watch for selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. When these crop up, we analyse them and go, no. When these crop up, we ask God at once to remove them. Well, that spoils the game, doesn't it? I heard many years ago someone saying, I shouldn't say what I'm about to say, this is on tape, but I don't care. So, I heard someone say in a galaxy far, far away that recovery was a long journey into the discovery of self. And that just makes me want to leave AA. What it's a long journey of, for me, is setting aside self and discovering the world and discovering all of the other people. I'm boring, but you, oddly, are very interesting to me, which is also partly why I have to go to Al-Anon, because you're slightly too interesting with your little problems and foibles and quirks and behaviours. Alcoholics are a lot of fun until they're not. But don't go straight to Al-Anon. If you go before you're entirely ready, the knitting will drive you crazy. So just wait until you're reduced to Al-Anon. And by the way, if you're in AA and you go to Al-Anon, don't tell them all about the big book. They don't care. And don't tell them about the steps you think you've done. They also don't care. They've seen it 1,000 times before. So what I was told to do is keep your big fat mouth shut and listen for a while. Listen for a good 5 years. That was about right. Because it works differently. My job is to set aside self in order that I can get on with what God's will is for me today, which is nothing fancy. Seeking God's will is not about asking God for a vision of what's on the jigsaw puzzle box so that I can construct the jigsaw puzzle. Based on that knowledge. It's not about pulling back the curtain and getting the universe to disclose its secrets. It's about learning the craft of putting one jigsaw puzzle piece next to another. Or here's a blue piece, here's another blue piece. Let's see if they go together. And you have to try 50 and then finally one goes in. That's what it's like. And I will never ever see what picture is on the box. I will never I'm the person putting the pieces in. I'll never get to stand back and see the effect. So the effect is none of my business. My job is simply to do one thing after another today. And my meditation in the morning is, God, what do you want me to do today? What attitude do you want me to take towards these things? And then I get on with it. And I should have progressed beyond this, but I haven't. When I think I've progressed from that onto more esoteric things, I'm in real trouble. So I have to keep things very, very simple. I don't know if anyone... where I go to meetings, everyone is about 12, and no one understands any of my analogies or memories or just... We have to explain it to them all afterwards. Does anyone remember Etch-a-Sketch? Very good. Okay, I'm in the right place. It was this wonderful thing where you draw a picture and then you swipe something at the bottom and the picture disappears. And every day of my recovery is like that. I get to wipe it at the end of the day by saying, was I resentful? Well, a couple of people I need to forgive. Was I frightened? A couple of situations I need to put in God's hands. That's the only solution I know to resentment is to forgive. I'll come to that in a bit. The only solution I know to fear is to put things in God's hands. I'll come to that in a bit. Do I have any secrets? Just go and tell someone. You don't need to explain the thing. You just need to disclose the thing. As soon as I'm explaining, I'm justifying. I think they call it Jedi mind tricks. Justification, explanation, defense, and the expressing of intentions. when my sponsor gives me information, for that's what is happening when he's talking. He's giving me information. This is not a conversation. My job is not to respond with all my justifications and explanations and defences for why I did what I did and all of my good intentions behind the action. Just disclose. That's the end of it. With that review, I'm simply taking all of those things and yielding them up to God. The trouble with the pen and paper approach with a daily review is it turns it into schoolwork for me. I've done enough of that. Didn't do me any good spiritually. Sort through prayer and meditation, conscious contact with God, not separation stuck in my own thoughts with my own analysis of myself, conscious contact with God. So that little time I spend, just a few minutes will do every day, reviewing. I do it with God, and everything I find, I yield up and surrender up, so I'm left with nothing. Not a great insight to run to a meeting with, nothing, which places me in a position where I can go to sleep. Then I get up the next morning, and in East London, a chap called Brendan says, you want to get in first thing in the morning with a preemptive strike against the devil. So I mentioned the D word, I shouldn't have done that. You'll get very exercised. I'm not going to go down that line. Oh, okay. There may or may not be a devil. Okay, there we go. Preemptive strike. And the preemptive strike is nothing special. It's God, please direct my thinking. Divorce my thinking from self-pity, self-seeking and dishonest motives. And I feel my limbs being chopped off at this point. I'm left with nothing. We consider our plans for the day. Nothing fancy about that. We ask God for inspiration, an intuitive thought or a decision. How do I know what God's will is? Well, first of all, you don't. Not for sure, not for certain, not 100%. Thomas Merton, who was a Trappist monk, after being silent in a Trappist monastery for many years, wrote a poem and prayer where he says, I have something like, I have no idea whether my notion of your will for me is in fact your will for me. That was his great conclusion. This is a monk who is unsure as to what God's will is for him, but he trusts that because he sincerely wants to do God's will, that's enough. And this great mystery about God's will, 99% of it is absolutely certain. Get up at the same time every day, have breakfast, have 3 or 4 square meals a day, get some exercise, no screen time late at night, go to lots of meetings, tell the truth, talk to your sponsor, do a daily review, do some daily meditation, go for a walk occasionally, get out in nature, go to work, do some work when you're at work, be diligent, keep your mouth largely shut, leave them lay where Jesus flagged them, step over the body, get on with your life. I mean, if you don't know what God's will is to do, just buy one day at a time in Al-Anon and whatever it says for today, do that. There's no great mystery. I don't need to run round to 47 people asking, what do you think God's will is for me? I just get on with my day. I find the modern world very tiring. I find social media very tiring. I find the media very tiring. I find technology very tiring. I find all of these voices telling you to take charge of your life and have visions and passions and dreams and where do you see yourself in 5 years? The answer to which is that I literally don't care. Just You want to hire me? Hire me. If you don't want to hire me, don't hire me. Let's not do any of this ridiculous dance. You want a typist? I type. Good. Let's get on with it. When people ask me what I do for a living, my other half instructs me to tell them you type, because that's literally what you do. You just sit at a keyboard and type things. He said he's recasting it, he describes it as spelling. I get home and he says, have you done good spelling today? That's all I have to do. But this idea of, you see, all my little hobby horses are going to come out now, aren't they? This line, which has been doing the rounds for a few years in London AA, I've cited it already, this notion of having a big life. And it's this idea of, having a console with all of these screens that you've got to monitor and be in charge of. And sometimes when people want to demonstrate that the program works, they tell you how well they're doing at work and the promotions they've got and the responsibilities they've been given. That's fair enough, nothing wrong with that. If that's God's will, great. But I tried that. I tried a version of AA for the first 8 or 9 years where the secret little plan, and I did do the steps in the first year, which is what kept me sober, and I made amends, and I was a good boy, and I started sponsoring people, and I did service at lots of meetings, and I kept my nose clean, and I kept my knickers on. I don't think the 13th step is a joking matter. People relapse and often die on relapses, and I do not want some trivial dalliance of mine with this person potentially to be part of the story of their destruction. One does not know what role one plays in people's lives. And my first sponsor said to me, "Princess, don't shit where you eat. If you must misbehave, do it a very long way from here." So my job in AA is to treat people wherever possible with civility and politeness, and to keep my eyes to myself and keep my hands to myself. So my first few years I was a good boy, but I had a plan. I thought, now that pesky alcohol's out of the way, I can go out into the world and get all of the things that alcohol was robbing me of. I can go and get a career. I can go and get some qualifications. I can get a house. I can get a relationship. I can get a social life. I can get holidays. I can get a mortgage. I can get pensions. And there was a vacuum inside me which I was trying to fill with all of these things. I was trying to adopt a way of life as a substitute for having no idea what my life was there for. And it's rather like gambling. Once you start to put money on the table, even though you're losing, the horror of admitting that you've already wasted so much money is mitigated only by the hope that if I gamble a little more, maybe I'll win it all back. And at 8 years sober, I found myself having panic attacks at 4 o'clock in the morning, circling the office in the morning, not able to go in because I was so stricken with fear. And what was going on was I was living for the first 8 years to a great degree on excitement and adrenaline and the flattery of money, power, property and prestige. And the thing about these drugs, which are as pernicious as alcohol, the horror of that is you need more and more. Just like with alcohol, you need more and more, but one's getting less and less of an effect. You're pumping more and more into your system. I've constructed this incredibly high-risk scenario in my life in business, because I thought I needed that to justify my existence on the planet. There were a couple of things that I discovered. I broke down, I left AA for a while, I didn't drink, but I became peculiar. And when I was done being peculiar, I got back to AA, and it was like you were talking a different language. It took a while to get used to it again. And it gave me actually an insight into what it would be like trying to come back to AA after drinking again. I mean, I hadn't had a drink, and yet everything that was said in meetings seemed alien and pointless. How much more would that be the case if all the mortar in my mind had been dissolved and washed away by alcohol? So I came back, and I did a couple of things. The first thing I did, and it took a while to realize that this was necessary, the first thing is I went through the first 164 pages of the big book and pretended I'd never read it before. And you discover there are different types of content. There are descriptions of alcoholism. There are warnings of what happens if one doesn't do something about one's alcoholism. There are some general principles, there are actions to take, and then there are promises. And there are a couple of other types of discourse in there as well. What I was told to do was to treat each statement about alcoholism like a mirror and say, is this me? Or each statement about living life as a mirror, is this me? A life run on self-will can hardly be a success. In other words, if my life is based on what I want, it's going to fail, even though I get my own way. The problem is not that I can't get my own way. The problem is that I can, and it's ashes in my mouth. So when I was 30 years old, I had everything that I thought I wanted, and I was dead inside and frantic. I went through the book, and the two things that I did, which I'd never fully done before, I'd disclosed everything in step 5s, and I think that is probably what had kept me sober. But I hadn't dotted the I's and crossed the T's with amends, and I hadn't forgiven everyone. And forgiveness, I thought it was about saying, in a rather patronising way to people, you've done a very good job, this is wonderful, but it wasn't what I wanted, but I can live with that. On page 65 it says the world and its people are often quite wrong. So I get to face the reality of the awful childhood and other things. But to say on page 66, they like me as sick, I like them and sick. Everything I did in my 20s, I hurt a lot of people in my 20s sober because I was concerned chiefly with myself. But I was driven by forces within me. Why? Because I hadn't given myself to God. God was the occasional little helper. And I got to recognise that other people were trapped in their own little prisons. Forgiveness is not something that I do in the sense of making my breakfast. Forgiveness is something I beg God to provide to me because I have no idea how to do it. I remember my poor old mother, God rest her soul, we had a very turbulent relationship. She had a bad war. Her father was in a concentration camp. She was very ill-treated by her mother. This was in Europe, not in the UK. She'd had 4 children before me, and 3 were dead, and the 4th was mentally ill and mentally handicapped. I was the last of her children, and all of the frustrations got channeled in my direction. I understand that now. And I asked God to show me how to forgive. And I thought it was going to be some intellectual exercise or some process where I had to go to a clinic in Switzerland or something. And it wasn't that at all. God's quicker, I think. If one absolutely surrenders, God is amazingly swift. And it was her 80th birthday, and we travelled down, and I knocked on the door, and she opened it, and I didn't see my mother. I saw a frail old woman that was pleased to see her son, but trepidatious and gearing up for a fight. And I saw her for the first time in my life, and that was the end of that resentment, which had been going on for decades. I made myself ready through the actions I took, through the considerations prompted by the Big Book. But the action was God's action, not my action. The other thing I hadn't done was go through my entire life. I'd done a whole load of amends the first time around, and I'd cleaned up most of my messes as I went along. What I was encouraged to do was to go through the Rolodex of my mind and write down the name of any person who my mind had snagged on for any reason. Any tension, awkwardness, embarrassment. Who would I not want to walk in the room? Who would I not want to blag, rich as they are with my secrets, to everyone else in my life? Who are the people I would dread encountering? Where are the places I wouldn't want to go in case I saw them? Who do I still harbour some kind of festering grudge against? And with each one of those people to say precisely what I did. No psychobabble, no abstraction. Literally, what did you do? What should you have done instead? If there's a gap between the two and they suffered, you owe an amend. People will say, this is what I've done, I don't know if I owe an amend. If you harmed them, you owe the amend. It's completely automatic. Now, the question of how to make the amend is an entirely different question. Some are done overtly, some are done covertly, some are done directly, some are done indirectly, but something needs to be done. And I cleared the list when I was 15 years sober. From the beginning of the process of seeking to clear the list to clearing the list was around 9 days. I just took time off work and did it. There was none of this nonsense of, in my time and in God's time. I'll tell you a story about that. It's a famous old Jewish story about a rabbi and a tailor. And the rabbi goes to the tailor and says, "Can you mend my coat?" And the tailor says, "Absolutely. God willing, it will be done by tomorrow." The rabbi turns up the next day, coat's not done. He says, "When is it going to be done?" The tailor says, "God willing, it'll be done by this afternoon." He turns up this afternoon, it's not done. He says, "When is it going to be done?" "God willing, it'll be tomorrow morning." And the rabbi says, "What if we leave God out of it this time? How about you make the decision to do it and get on with it?" When that decision is made, it's amazing what happens. And I keep a list of people that I could not find. Some I don't even know the name. Others I know the first name. There was one left. Someone I went to school in Germany for a while, and my best friend when I was there, I lost touch with. And there were a couple of incidents that I felt absolutely tortured about. They weren't major, but the magnitude of the guilt or shame or embarrassment has got nothing to do with the magnitude of the event, but it had a psychic importance to me. Psychic in the sense of mind, not paranormal. And I couldn't find him. I looked him up. Every year I go through the list. I looked him up again and again and again. And I was in a meeting on Step 8 a couple of years ago when I got this sudden urge, this impulse, which was irresistible, to have one more look. And it was pointless. I'd been looking for many years. And I knew a few facts about his life which would help me to do some searching. And I found a website, something which had been recently published, where there was reference to someone from 20 years earlier, which had his first name and his surname, but attached to a different barrel, so it was a double-barreled surname. And I followed that track, and I paid some money to an agency in America, and I tracked him down. I hadn't been able to find him, so his surname had changed, but there was this brief window when he was operating under the double-barreled surname. There was one reference only on the internet, and it's since disappeared, which is bizarre. But I found him, and I tracked him down. I wrote to him, he wrote back immediately. And we go and stay with the family every summer in Vermont. And the curious thing is, my 30th AA birthday was spent giving the eulogy at my best friend's funeral. The best friend who died with active addiction. And as luck would have it, we were going to stay with this family immediately afterwards. It can't be arranged. This sort of thing can't be arranged. This idea that I have constructed my own life. When I was 11, I remember turning my face to the wall and gesturing in the general direction of the universe, saying, "You can keep it." Not interested. If it wasn't for that, then I don't think I would have become an alcoholic, seeing what alcohol did to my brother. If I didn't have the perilous physical craving, which means that when I take a drink, I become someone that is not remotely interested in sobriety. If I didn't have that and the mental obsession which compels me to drink because there is no other voice in my head, I wouldn't have needed to come to AA. If I hadn't come to AA, I wouldn't have been able to spend with my other half the last 5 years looking after my mother. She died at the age of 94. When she was 89, she became very ill, and she went into hospital, and it was touch and go for a while. And when she came out, she wasn't the same. It's very common when people are very old and they go into a hospital, they come out very disorientated, and that disorientation can last for months, and sometimes it never goes. Just a couple of weeks will do it. And she was unable to, we got all the pills in the pill box, but she kept getting the pill box upside down. So she'd take from the right place, but the thing was upside down. So she'd take the morning thing at night and the night thing in the morning. It was impossible. And we got her into a home near where we lived. And before she got ill at the age of 89, she was still very tense. She had enough reasons, as I explained, and there were other things as well in her life. Terrible things. She had good reason to be a tense old woman at 89. But we were given 5 years, and during those 5 years, we would take her out every Sunday. And we put her in the wheelchair. She lost her mobility. She could stagger a few steps, but that was about all. So we put her in a wheelchair, we'd wheel her through the park, her eyesight was going, and we'd count the dogs in the park and describe the dogs, and we'd wheel her to a rose garden, and we'd describe the roses, and we'd pull down the roses for her to smell one by one. And we'd go to a Turkish cafe where they always addressed her. When they saw us coming, they would say hello to her before they said hello to us. She couldn't see them, but they called her Mammy. They treated her like she was their mother, and she ordered the same thing every Sunday for 5 years. And we used to sit in the same place and watch There was a big African church, people with amazing costumes coming out, and we would describe what people were wearing to her. Then we'd give her an ice cream on the way back and take her home. And this was our Sunday for 5 years. I'll come back to that, the point of that. When I was a teenager, I was obsessed with the question of, who am I? I don't know who I am. And then you'd read a book and you think, oh, maybe I'm an abstract expressionist or something. And then I was a communist, and then I was a this, and then I was a... I mean, if you're a communist, fine, knock yourself out. I don't happen to be right now. I was trying to find out who I was, and it was a ridiculous thing. Because who I am is what is constructed through the life that I live. How can one possibly answer that at the age of 16 or 18? You haven't lived it yet. There isn't an answer to that question, and it's certainly not a set of labels. I don't have an identity in that sense. I don't know what I do with one. Put it on the wall. I am completely lost by the question of identity. But what I have the sense of is purpose. My mother was a fastidious woman, and she was always tidying and organising and arranging and throwing things away and rationalising and keeping things beautifully ordered. But the one thing that she'd never ordered was herself. And over the last 5 years, all of the memories from her childhood came back one by one and were expressed, often very incoherently because her mind was going. But they were expressed, they'd bloom and explode and be gone. And then that memory would never come back again. And she folded and ironed and put away every single one of those memories until she died at complete peace. And Jonathan and I were part of that. I don't know. Maybe I'm an alcoholic in order that Jonathan and I could give her those 5 years. My best friend who died got sober originally in the late 90s and then relapsed after a few years, got sober again in 2010, and we were completely inseparable for 10 years until some things started to change. And when he died, and I'm ashamed to say this, there was a moment when I thought all of that time invested in that relationship and now it's gone. And how sickeningly ungrateful of me. I was given those 10 years. Maybe my job was to be his friend for those 10 years, and that was the job. It wasn't for me to get a payoff at the end of it. The thing itself was the point. And there are dozens of these things in my life. None of the things which I think are of any value at all in my life are the sort of things that they talk about on LinkedIn. And my life is very simple today. And I know a lot of people who are very troubled. And I talked to Jonathan about some of the troubled people that we know. And I asked him once, why do you think we don't argue? We've been together 20 years. I said to him, why do you think we don't argue? And he says, because we don't want to. And then he says, why can't people be simple like us? And I don't know the answer to that. But I decided at some point I wanted to keep it simple. And God showed up and made it possible. Thank you for listening.